It's true, and I'm happy to do that. I love people that want to learn about the native environment of the Piedmont because it's kind of my thing. I've been here a long time. I've actually lived in North Carolina since before I was 2 years old. So you don't run into that many people like that anymore around here, but I am an old timer. So I gave the guys, David and Craig, a list of things I could talk about off the top of my head, and this is the one they said I should start with. So that's what you're going to learn today about Tallamy Keystone species. What are they and why are they important? How many of you guys know who Doug Tallamy is? I had a feeling. Okay, but let's start at the beginning. What's a keystone? Okay, it comes from architecture. And so Gothic architecture has that keystone in the middle there is what holds the whole arch together. If that keystone isn't there, the whole thing comes down. Okay, so next slide. The ecologists thought that would be a wonderful analogy for them when they talk about ecosystems. So they identified something called a keystone species. And what they are the species that there's nothing that can replace them really in the system, and if they disappear, the system doesn't really work well anymore, or sometimes not at all. And keystone species can come in several different varieties. The ones that are most often talked about are predator species, like wolves out west, which when they went away, all the populations got out of balance and everything went kaflooey. They reintroduced wolves and things went back into balance. But also herbivores, plant eaters can be keystone species. In the African savanna, the elephant is a keystone species because it rips acacia trees right out of the ground and maintains the savanna grassland. If they weren't there, the trees would come back and the savanna would disappear and that entire ecosystem would vanish. Another kind of keystone is called a mutualist, and those are a pair of species. And it's usually a pollinator-plant relationship. Think about fruit bats and how critical they are to pollinating certain tropical fruits. They wouldn't finish their life cycle without the fruit bats there. Okay, next slide. Douglas Tallamy, for those who don't know who he is, he's a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware, and his work focuses on insect-plant interactions and how they affect ecosystem diversity. That's what he's devoted his life to, is looking at those relationships. When his first book came out in 2007, his first book is Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens. When it was published in 2007, he was immediately compared to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. How many of you guys know who Rachel Carson was? Okay. Rachel Carson, back in the 60s, was a scientist who figured out that DDT was killing all the birds, okay, because it was getting in their eggs, birds, the higher level birds in the ecosystem. And she spent 4 years putting together her data because nobody was talking like this in the 1960s. And she put such solid data together that she could not be ignored when her book came out, Silent Spring. It's also very well written. She was a really fine writer. And she's sort of considered the mother of the modern ecological, anti-pesticide type movement. And DDT was outlawed in the United States because of her work, okay? So a lot of people think Doug Tallamy is equally important in his own way. He's also written more books since the 2007 book. You go to the next one. These are his books. Living Landscape he co-wrote with Rick Dark, and I consider that kind of a show and tell book. It's got useful information in it, but it's really, Rick Dark is a professional photographer, and it's a very pretty book, and he's trying to show you how pretty native plants can be, and I have nothing against that, but it's not really relevant to what Tallamy's primary work has been. So beside Bringing Nature Home, his first book, the second book was Nature's Best Hope on the right, and then his most recent book is The Nature of Oaks. All of these books, well, all of his books, not Living Landscape, are on audiobook. If those of you who don't like to read but like to listen, they are all on audiobook. My favorite book of these to get people interested in things is Nature of Oaks, and that's because Tallamy is a scientist, and so he writes like a scientist, and he believes in justifying everything he says with data, and I respect that, and that's the way scientists are supposed to work. But when you're trying to write a book that the public is going to read, people start dozing off, quite frankly, because he's piling on the data too much. He does less of that, or he does it better in The Nature of Oaks, because all he talks about is the oak tree that was growing in his backyard, basically. And he uses that as the springboard to talk about how oaks affect ecosystems throughout the year. So you go through the whole thing, and he manages to pull in all his beloved factoids, but in a way that's a lot more accessible to the average person. So I highly recommend maybe starting with that book, because a lot of the same facts that he's mentioned in the other books are still in The Nature of Oaks, just in a more palatable form, I would say. Nature's Best Hope is the book in which he proposed what he calls America's natural, what does he call it? America's national parks. His concept is that we shouldn't just keep national parks to keep all our species intact and pristine environments. We need to be putting native plants in everywhere, so that everything's a contiguous national park, in the sense that wildlife will be able to move freely throughout. Okay? A lot of his research focused on the dependence of insects on plants and the dependence of birds on insects. And he focused there because the larval stages of the majority of insects need plant food. I'm talking caterpillars primarily. And often specific species of plants. For example, songbirds require almost entirely caterpillars to feed their young. And when that relationship breaks down, when the plants disappear and the caterpillars don't have anything to eat, then the birds die. He has a well-known example in his books that he always uses, and I love to use it because it pulls at heartstrings of regular folks. It's the story of the suburban chickadees. He and his students monitored birdhouses in a suburb, somewhere up where he is in Delaware, for where chickadees were nesting, and they had several sets of them. And they were weekly going in and noting, how the birds were growing, what they were eating. They would observe what the parents were bringing, and things like that. And it got to the end, and all of a sudden the houses weren't active anymore. And they looked inside, and all the chicks, the baby birds, were dead, and they were buried in birdseed. Because what had happened is, in many suburbs, there's not enough native food for the parents to find enough caterpillars to feed those baby birds. And in desperation, they tried feeding them the seeds that they were surviving on, but the baby birds can't handle seeds. They need the protein of a caterpillar. So I find it a very effective story because babies always, we always want babies to be happy, right? And so to know that these parents were valiantly trying to feed their babies and buried them in seed, and these babies starved to death, because these suburbs not only lack native plants in many cases, but they also use way too many poisons, as I'm sure you're aware. I mean, there are whole suburbs around here who get together and spray poison 30 feet into the trees to control the mosquitoes. I mean, imagine what that's doing to the wildlife. The company that does that I know of says, well, it's okay, it doesn't kill honeybees. Well, it doesn't outright kill them, but I've looked up the poison. It does get in their honey. And it is also fatal to all aquatic species. So if you have a stream out there, and think about spraying poison 30 feet in the air. If there's baby birds up there, I mean, give me a break. I'm sure it's killing a lot of things. So of course, there's not enough natural food for the birds. So this is becoming a critical issue. We are losing bird species because we're losing insect species because we're losing plant species. Okay? Next one. One of the things that Tallamy did for us is he crunched the numbers because he's a scientist. So one of the tables in his first book, Bringing Nature Home, is called Woody Plants Ranked by Ability to Support Lepidoptera Species. Lepidopteras are the moths and the butterflies. And this is just some excerpts of some genera that you probably see every day. Oaks support 517 different species of moths and butterflies. Think about that. 517 different species of insects need oak trees to feed their caterpillars and get to the next stage. Think about how much food that is for wildlife. Willows, 456. Cherries and plums, 448. birches, 413, blueberries, 288 different species of lepidopterans need blueberries. Maples, 285, pines support 203, ashes, as we all know, in big trouble, 150 different species of moths and butterflies eat ash trees. Think about how that's going to impact the ecosystem as we're losing all the ashes to the emerald ash borer. And beeches support 126. So these are big numbers, and you begin to see how substantial they are. And this is why Tallamy's been yelling his head off and throwing numbers at us to try to help us understand it. In the same book, in Appendix 2, he lists the host plants, of butterflies and showy moths. And the reason he did that is because butterflies and showy moths are the ones regular people notice, okay? So we're talking tiger swallowtails, monarchs, luna moths, things like that. So he looked specifically at those to help people sort of identify more heavily with the kind of relationships and losses. The hackberry butterfly only eats hackberries. So if we lose Celtis, we'll lose that butterfly. It's actually a very pretty butterfly. Red-spotted purples eat cherries and willows. Viceroys only eat willows. Fortunately, as far as I know, willows are okay because viceroy is a kind of cool plant. Viceroy, in case you don't know, is the monarch butterfly mimicker. It looks to the casual observer like a monarch because it's trying to pretend it is one, but it's actually a different species. Banded hairstreaks eats several species of oaks and also hickories. The spice bush swallowtail, a really pretty, showy butterfly we get around here, only eats spice bush and sassafras, and because of the invasive non-native ambrosia beetle that is wiping out that group of species down at the coast, and I'm afraid probably moving this way, I hope not, we might lose our spice bush swallowtails because all they eat is spice bush and sassafras. Eastern tiger swallowtails, on the other hand, are generalists. They eat birches, black cherry, tulip poplar, and willows. And I noticed this year in my yard, I had gazillions of eastern tiger swallowtails, especially compared to the other showy butterflies. And I'm sure it's because there's so much more food out there for them to eat, their caterpillars to eat. So they're doing all right, and I expect we'll continue to see eastern tiger swallowtail butterflies for a while, even if we start losing spice bush swallowtails and any other ones that lose their food. Zebra swallowtails only eat pawpaws. It's an exciting moment in my yard when I see a zebra swallowtail, because I don't see that many, because all they eat is pawpaws. And then the great ash sphinx moth, which is one of the big, large, showy moths, only eats ashes. So I'm thinking it's probably doomed. Next slide. Thank you. Showy moths that include ash trees as their important larval food sources include the Promethea moth. I took that picture of that one. It was eating a button bush on my floodplain underneath my ash trees. So I think it eats more than just ashes, but clearly it was probably in the neighborhood because of the ash trees. These are big caterpillars. And then a number of sphinx moths eat ash trees. The apple, the fawn, the wave sphinx, and then the banded tussock moth also eats ash trees. On my property, until recently, the dominant canopy species was ash. I had 37 mature ash trees on my floodplain. They are well on their way to dying from the emerald ash borer. So the ecosystem in my own yard is changing dramatically, and it's going to be very interesting to see what species I stop seeing and what species I do see. One of the bird species I'm seeing right now in great numbers is the red-headed woodpecker, and they've come in because of the emerald ash borer. But I fully expect them to disappear in a few years when all the ashes are fully dead. Now, saplings of ashes persist in the environment for a while until the borers get to them. But I don't think they can possibly make up for the biomass required by these caterpillars that are fully reliant on ash trees. Think about the difference between a sapling and a mature canopy species. And so I still think, maybe they won't outright die for a while. Maybe they'll try to, but imagine, there's going to be a lot of caterpillars trying to eat these skinny little saplings. It's not going to go well. So by crunching these numbers and giving us this hard data, what Tallamy has done is allow conservation groups to latch onto that and come up with some really helpful tools for regular folks and for people trying to educate regular folks. And so you want to click on the first one? This is a list, you can't see it, but just so you know, that link will take you to a list of wildlife keystone species for our region. And it's not just trees, it's everything, okay? So that's one list. The National Wildlife Federation focuses on species for all wildlife. The second link is the New Hope Audubon's list of keystone species for birds, specifically in the North Carolina Piedmont. New Hope Audubon, if you don't know, is our local Audubon chapter for Durham, Orange, and Chatham County. They are amazing. Their website is astonishing. They have a wonderful program called Bird-Friendly Habitat Certification, where for $50, they'll go out and tell you everything growing on your land, and then tell you what you might want to think about doing to make it better for the bird habitat. They'll identify your invasive species if you have it. And if you have a magnificent yard full of native plants and no invasives, they'll give you their highest certification and give you a little plaque that you can put in your yard. And the best thing about it is they'll come back year after year if you continue to work on your yard, say you don't make it the first time, but you take to heart their report. They give you a written report. They'll come back for free and tell you, oh, you've done this now and this now, you know, this is excellent, do this, but now you've earned a gold star instead of a nothing star. So it's a great program, and they couldn't have developed it without Tallamy's data. Tallamy is the key here. He is the jumping off point. And likewise, these groups on a national level have developed online tools that identify native plants suitable for any U.S. region. These are really cool. National Wildlife Federation, you go in here and you plug in your zip code or your address, and it will generate a list of native plants that will do well in your area, okay? Now, it's not perfect in that they don't consider site conditions and things like that, but just to have a list to start from is a great jump up, because your average homeowner hadn't got a clue, you know, what's native and what's not and what makes sense. And this is a wonderful way to start, and it provides you with, you know, pictures and information, and you can go to your local nursery and say, I need this, this, and this. And I think that's a wonderful tool. And similarly, the National Audubon Society has done this specifically for birds. You go in, you put in your address or your zip code, and boom, it will tell you all the species you might want to consider if you want to improve bird habitat in your yard. Okay, so Tallamy gave us the tools. Conservation groups are using that data to speak for the trees and offer story, because frankly the best way to reach the average person who owns a house is to tell them stories. Don't overwhelm them with data, but tell them stories about why this is the way it is and what's happening. And one of the things I like to tell them is a little more information about the trees you guys work with every day. For example, white oaks need 200 years to reach full maturity. A white oak is not a mature tree for 200 years, and then they can last for 500. So when I see somebody with a nice looking oak tree in their yard, I congratulate them. I say, congratulations, did you know that your white oak is supporting 517 different species of caterpillars, and that it takes 200 years to get to the point where it can do everything it's supposed to be doing in the ecosystem? You know, good on you, and let's work to keep that tree happy, because it is a significant keystone species around here. Hickories don't get fully productive until 40 years, and they can live another 200. They support 235 different species of caterpillars. Sweet gums, the much maligned sweet gum, needs 20 to 30 years to begin full seed production. It can last 150 years. It supports 35 species of caterpillars, but it's a key food for Luna moths. Everybody loves Luna moths. And chickadees and American goldfinches rely heavily on the seed of sweet gums, okay? So when you disparage the sweet gums because the balls are getting in your lawn, you're really doing a disservice. And my response to that, by the way, if you have a client who might be willing to listen, the problem with sweet gum balls in your lawn is that you planted your sweet gum in a lawn, okay? And the solution is very simple. Give it the environment it's supposed to have. Trees don't grow in lawns. Trees grow in forests with leaf duff, and everything around it is working together. And if you read The Nature of Oaks, Tallamy's book, he talks a long time about oak mulch, which can persist the dead leaves for 2 years. And there's a whole massive ecosystem of little critters, some of which are moths and butterflies, that complete their life cycles in oak duff. They eat dead oak leaves. They actually eat the dead oak leaves. So when you blow them all away and burn them or whatever, you're destroying all kinds of ecosystems. And the same is true for the sweet gums. They'll be much happier if you just let them have, mulch, or better yet, their natural leaves just all around them. And don't worry about your lawn. Lawns serve no ecological purpose. They're not native. They're dead. They're dead zones, and we don't need any more dead zones. Red maples support 285 different species of caterpillars, and they take 70 to 80 years to get to full maturity, and they'll last another 150 years. Loblolly pines support 203 different species of caterpillars. It takes them 150 years to be fully mature, and they can persist for more than 200. John Lawson, a famous colonial botanist who wandered this area a long time ago in the 1600s, he was writing up a very glowing report of the area, trying to get people to come colonize in the United States. And he was tromping through the woods somewhere around here, and he came across a huge loblolly pine, and it was really unusual back then because the dominant forest cover was deciduous, and the loblollies were only in very rare, usually wet areas. But he stumbled across this massive loblolly, and it was so unusual he wrote about it. But loblolly pines are, pine trees in general, but especially around here, loblollies, are key habitat for the brown-headed nuthatch. They eat pine seeds, and they nest in cavities in pine trees. The problem is they don't have woodpecker beaks. They have little bitty nuthatch beaks, and so they can only manage to dig holes in dead wood. So they need a mature pine that'll have a little dead wood in it that they can excavate for their nesting hole. And then, of course, that's going to fall off, and they need another one. And the way the local Audubon group is helping is they will sell you a brown nuthatch box. And then if you have a stand of pines, you can put your nuthatch box up, and they will have the cavity they need to nest in, and they've got the food source, and they will persist. But that nuthatch is under pressure right now because so many pines are disappearing that are the right size for their habitat. I have a nice little mini group of pines that are probably 75 to 100 years old at the top of my hill, and it's full of happy nuthatches that live there. And I have so much dead wood on my property between the emerald ash borer and the beavers and everything else that they have plenty of places to nest, so I haven't put up boxes specially for them, and they seem to be doing just fine. But I know a lot of people think loblollies are the enemy, and I just, if you get a chance, by the way, this is actually an important tree too. Okay, and there's one other little factoid here I want to hit you with. In the last few years, two scientists, Dr. Diana Beresford Kroger and Dr. Suzanne Simard, have done really interesting work about communication in the forest between trees, okay? Beresford Kroger has degrees in biochemistry and botany, and Simard has a degree in forestry. Beresford Kroger has identified compounds in trees that are biochemically identical to human brain neurotransmitters. Think about that. Why would a tree be exuding a chemical like that unless it were using it for perhaps something like talking to everybody else in the forest, okay? And Simard is famous for figuring out that the forest fungal networks, the mycorrhizae, are critical to communication in the forest, and that's how one tree will warn another of danger. And warn, is a loaded word, but you know what I mean. They are sensing environmental changes, and they communicate through these networks. Some of these chemicals that Beresford Kroger has identified are actually emitted through the leaves. They're in the air. It's thought, about nature bathing, how you go out in the forest and feel better. Well, part of that is they're actually exuding calming chemicals through the biochemical networks, okay? It's pretty nifty. But the problem is the ones that do that the best and the ones that are key to the communication network are the mature trees. And both Beresford Kroeger and Suzanne Simard call them mother trees. And so I think of these as also keystone species. Basically, any mature tree in our forest right now is a keystone because it's a mother tree. It's the ones that's sending out the communications to help the forest evolve correctly. So when we clear cut a forest, we lose all that information. There are no mother trees left. Everything, if you replant it, it's an even age forest. So there's nothing there to pull things together. So it's never going to be as healthy as it was when the keystone mother trees were there doing their jobs. And for those of you who like to listen to books, Beresford Kroeger's book here, To Speak for the Trees, is on audiobook. Simard's, for some reason, is not, and that's a shame because it's a really good book. But what they both demonstrate is that the forest is more than a food web of interdependent species. It's also a living, breathing, and they would say sentient, not in the sense we are sentient, but it's sentient. It's present. It's responding and reacting and communicating with the members, okay? And that's an aspect we like to pretend, a lot of folks like to pretend doesn't happen. Well, we'll just cut that down. It doesn't matter. Well, you've just cut off your arm, basically. So it does matter. So, Tallamy's keystone species and why they're important. Because he provided the data for the conservation groups that allow them to talk to people with examples and numbers and stories that regular folks can relate to. That tree on the left was a native red oak on my property that had to come down because it was heart rot all the way to the bottom, and it was 90 feet tall when we took it down. And boy, did that change my local ecology. It was heartbreaking to have to take that one down. The one on the right is my sweet gum. It's an enormous sweet gum. And every year it puts out all kinds of sweet gum balls to the point where it's hard to walk underneath it. But flocks of cedar waxwings and chickadees and all the other birds come and enjoy those seeds. And in the fall, when those balls ripen on a quiet day, you can hear the seeds raining down like, you know, a gentle shower. And it's amazing. And all the wildlife is taking advantage of it. And that's a willow oak that we had to decapitate this year because it started to lean and was about to fall over. And the one on the right is one of my river birches, which are very healthy. Oaks, 517 species of caterpillars. River birches, 413 species of caterpillars. So you guys already speak for the trees every day by the nature of what you do, and I thank you for your work. If you find a client who wants to go further, who says, you know, I really like this tree, or I wonder what I should plant here, or stuff like that, I hope that I've equipped you with a little more information, a few factoids you can throw out. Did you know your beautiful oak supports this? Did you know that pine trees are essential to the brown-headed nuthatch? We can thank Tallamy for getting people talking in this way about these relationships, which are so critical to whether or not we all still get to be here. And with climate change and pressure from deforestation and invasives, these stories are more important than ever. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
One more slide.
Yeah.
That's me.
Yeah.
That's my blog. That's my email if you care to.
Time for a few questions?
Absolutely. Ask questions. Ask questions. Anybody have questions?
Are you on TikTok?
No, I am not. I am not on TikTok. I'm not a big fan of cameras.
Real question, is that Lobelia cardinalis?
It is indeed.
Is that a keystone species?
Probably not, but it's a beautiful native. And when I was trying to come up with something that would sort of be my little logo-ish thing, we had some nice pictures, and my talented husband turned it into a graphic for me. So that's how that happened. I really love cardinal flowers. They're all over my property. I just, in the fall, when the seed heads finish, I just walk around my floodplain and shake them, you know, and just add more. Easy.
Catherine, I have a question. Oftentimes, you know, we are helping clients make informed decisions about their land. In some of the newer developments, when a lot of the construction practices are just to start over, and we have somebody with inevitably a declining red maple in their front yard, and it's planted in the construction layer, and they're looking for it, like say that thing declines to the point of being replaced. What would you recommend in that setting? You know, knowing that it was a hard reset. like what would your thoughts be to advise them to take the best?
Are we talking postage stamp yard?
Yeah.
Because scale is an issue.
Yeah.
Scale is an issue. In my ideal fantasy world, I would have every house in these postage stamp suburbs plant one canopy species. And then by doing that, we would have enough to support wildlife at that scale. But if that's not practical, and it usually isn't because it's very hard to get a group of people to all agree on the same thing, what I do is I recommend building the forest layers a step down. So I would recommend instead a subcanopy species.
Okay.
And build from there. So, and we have so many beautiful ornamental subcanopy species from sourwood. Sourwood's one of my favorite underused trees. And if it's not growing in a forest, it's not going to lean. I don't know if you guys have probably noticed, but you know, sourwoods tend to, what they're doing is they're trying to find the light. But if you plant it in full sun, it's not going to do that. It's going to go straight up. So that's not really an issue. And our usual trees like redbuds and dogwoods, but none of them are going to be happy if you plant them in your lawn, okay? So my first step always is to try to help people understand you have to create a bed even for trees. So loosen the soil all the way around, leave enough room that there's not grass growing on top of it, because the chemicals that people put in their lawns and the overwatering of lawns is really bad for trees. Trees don't want to be watered regularly a little bit. We all know that. That's not how they evolved. So whenever possible, I try to persuade people that just think how beautiful it'll look. If you had this little natural area here and you had your subcanopy species, and then once it grows for a few years, you can add some shrubs underneath that, and you start to recreate the forest layers of a Piedmont forest that Piedmont expects to have, and you'll have just a little mini Piedmont patch, I call it, where wildlife can park and survive. So you plant your understory species, then you add your shrubs, and we have an array of wonderful native shrubs, from oak leaf hydrangeas to native azaleas to blueberries. You know, and we just learned how many species blueberries support. And once you have that, then you can even add some pretty little wildflowers underneath that are well adapted again. And then you're feeding you have a little mini ecosystem, a little Piedmont patch. And if everybody did that in that neighborhood, wildlife could move from patch to patch to patch and perhaps persist more successfully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much. We have any questions, guys?
You took mine, David, so.
Okay, yeah. Patrick.
When you were showing that list of the species and how many caterpillars they supported, is there any overlap there, or is that kind of species specific?
No, you mean does it eat more than one thing? Is that what you mean?
Does one caterpillar eat like oaks and birches?
Some of them, like the eastern tiger swallowtail, eats an array of them. Some of them are species specific. So yeah, you're definitely seeing some redundancy there, but still, you know.
Yeah. I seem to recall 90% of trees of insects are specialists, as opposed to.
That's probably, you know, I don't know that number, but it wouldn't surprise me.
If I know it, it's from Tallamy.
Well, it's probably in there somewhere. And the man is, his books are jam-packed with stuff like that, and it's kind of overwhelming. It kind of just sort of washes over you, which is why I'm so glad that conservation groups have extracted key pieces of information and made them into accessible tools for regular people. Because Tallamy, bless his heart, I mean, I was a technical writer for many years, and I worked with technical experts, and they can't see the forest for the trees, because to them every piece of information is equally important, and I respect that, and I'm glad they feel that way. But when you're trying to explain things to regular people, you have to paint a picture that sort of prioritizes the relationships so that people can see what's the key message I need to take from this. And Tallamy's not always as successful as, in my opinion, at that, but that's just me. Yes, sir.
Not specifically a tree question, but more on the lines of invasive non-natives. A lot of folks who might want to get rid of the invasive non-natives on their property have adjacent properties that are going to have invasive non-natives that are going to spread back into their property.
Yep.
Are there strategies or particular native plants that are better at competing against some of these non-natives?
Yes, and that's going to be a real site-specific issue, you know. In my yard, where of course I've worked very hard to eradicate At least the woody invasives, I've given up on microstegium. I mean, on my floodplain, because it floods regularly, there's no point. I've just surrendered. But I will every winter walk underneath, especially evergreen trees, because that's where the birds sit in the winter, and then plant the invasives. So I'll pull out the behonias and the privets and the iliagnus that's starting to show up. But it's easy once you remove the big ones. At least when the birds plant the new ones, if you're persistent, you can stay ahead of those. And those are frankly doing more damage, big picture, to the ecosystem, the privets especially, than microstegium. Microstegium is a pain, but I still see a lot of natives persisting in that environment. But the woody invasives are the big problem. But yeah, you can do it. And there are definitely the evergreen spreaders like wax myrtle. And if it's a moist environment, Florida anise tree and things like that, they're evergreen. They like to spread. They will outcompete a lot of invasives. Okay, so there are trees, but again, it's kind of site specific.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead. Last question.
Sorry, last question. Is there a way in which having a treated ash tree is worse than having no ash tree?
Speaking as a person who struggled with this question, I, on the advice of the conservation director of the Botanical Garden who recently retired, I treated one male and one female in my yard for several years. But knowing that anything that took a bite out of that tree was dying, not just the emerald ash borer, and knowing that having read the studies now that show that emerald ash borer doesn't sweep through an area and then move on and it's gone. It persists in the environment. And there are places up north where people stopped treating their ash tree after 20 years, and in 5 years it was dead from emerald ash. We now know that emerald ash borers are persisting in those small saplings even. They can apparently persist in a tree with the diameter of a finger, okay? And they're not leaving, apparently, at least until we deplete the seed bank of ashes in the forest. Maybe then there will be nothing left, except they'll eat the fringe trees then, and then maybe they'll leave. But it's a long-term thing. So because of that, I decided I was kidding myself, and it was almost painful to see these two beautiful ash trees and then watch all my other ash trees declining. So I've made the decision not to treat mine anymore. And at least for now, as the poison fades away, the other insects will be able to eat it for a while before it's gone. But it's heartbreaking, and I am trying to reimagine my floodplain. Fortunately for me, thanks to the beavers, black willow is moving in great numbers, and I think it's going to be my new dominant canopy eventually, but it's going to be a while.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.